Hey, what is up, everybody? Welcome to another Blender Hangout and live stream. My name is Brandon Hicks, and I'm your host. So tonight we're going to get into doing some really cool stuff with Blender and Substance Painter. And before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about where I'm personally headed with courses in the future. So if you've been watching the YouTube channel, or even if you're just getting on, tonight's going to be a good night because we're going to talk about what's coming down the pike for all of my future Blender courses. So let me switch over here to my other screen and kind of show you where we are headed. Okay, so these are some basic course ideas, and I'm probably going to do a separate video on this that just talks about this one topic. But for those of you here tonight, you're going to get a little bit of a sneak preview. So if you're not familiar with my training platform, I have a new training platform at theorangeguild.com, and these are all the new courses that I'm thinking about doing for Blender training. So what I would like from you guys tonight is, first of all, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please subscribe and like the video. But for these topics, I'm looking for feedback. So I've been kind of talking with people in the community and delving into some ideas for courses, but I need to know from you guys if this is going to be helpful to you. Otherwise, it's really not going to be useful for me to head down this path. So if you take a look at these, we can go through them one by one. First course is going to be all about covering what we're talking about tonight, but it's going to be more in depth about 3D illustration. The next course is going to be about just cycles and rendering for people that haven't ever used it before. 2.8 is going to get its own course, which is really, really good. We're going to do an entire course on topology skills, and it's just going to be focused on how to structure your topology for 3D modeling. And so this will get into hard surface and stuff like that, and best practices there. Then I'm going to do an entire course just on 3D theory and concepts for people that are just getting into it. So if you don't know what a polygon is, or faces, edges, vertices, any of the operations and basic terminology we would talk about in 3D modeling or the rest of the 3D pipeline, then this is going to be a good course for you. I'm going to talk about how to start sculpting in Blender basics, and for people that are looking to kind of accomplish the same thing you would in some program like ZBrush and Blender, this is going to be a good course because it's going to go over all of the basic things you need to know to be able to sculpt. We're going to talk about 3D animation in Blender for people that are just starting out. So if you've never done animation before, that'll be a good course for you. 3D visual effects inside Blender is something that needs a whole course on its own. And so we're going to be talking about some basic workflows for doing things like green screening, motion tracking, compositing, things like that in this course. And we're going to do an entire course just on mastering UV unwrapping. So I've spent a lot more time lately getting in and kind of tweaking assets and figuring out how to optimize that workflow. And so we're going to talk about that a lot because I know a lot of people have talked about having issues with learning how to do that. So that'll be good. We're going to do a whole course just on mastering cinematic lighting so you can get a more cinematic look with your renders. So that'll be good for learning lighting setups. I'm planning on updates for the Blend Master Series Volume 1 and 2. If you're familiar with this is where I go in and show people how to build an entire concept car from the ground up. The first course is all about modeling the exterior. The second course is all about building custom procedural shaders and cycles for that. So these courses have been out for a while now, but they're going to be getting some updates at some point in the future. I'm not sure when, but I was talking to another student today about that, and I hope that I can jump on that quickly. Character animation fundamentals is going to be just about bipedal character animation for this course. Creature design sculpting is going to be all about the concept art process and how to build creatures in Blender from this. Photorealistic humans is going to be specifically geared towards perfecting things like skin shaders, getting the eyes looking correct in renders, human anatomy, and nailing that when you're sculpting, or whether you're trying to retopologize that when you are creating photorealistic humans, and ultimately just how to get that photorealism in place. So this looks like it's a copy of something else I had up here. We're going to talk about simulating destruction in Blender, which is going to be how to shatter objects, blow things up, things like that, which is going to be good. We're going to also talk about how to simulate weather and other natural effects. So think about tornadoes, rain, oceans, lava, all sorts of stuff like that. And then finally, we're going to talk about the top 5 paid add-ons for Blender and how to use them. And so this is going to be good if you're into certain of the paid add-ons like hard ops and things like that. We're going to do a brief overview of each of them and then how to get started using them for people that are interested in getting into those extensions for Blender. So sorry for kind of taking a sidestep in the first part of this stream, but I wanted to give you guys a basic idea of where I'm headed in the future. And this is going to be what dominates my time for the foreseeable ever, because it's going to be a lot of content. So leave me a comment. Please let me know if you like the list, if you think there needs to be changes, if you want more, let me know. I'm also planning on doing some real-time graphics courses for things like game development, virtual reality, augmented reality, stuff like that. And then some that are just based on illustration and design. I'm not going to talk about these right now, but these are not going to be just Blender specific. We're also going to get into game engines and other stuff like that. So I don't know if I'm going to be doing all these courses. I may get some help, but if you guys have any ideas on other courses you want to learn, or if you really, really like one of these courses in particular and want me to do it soon, write me a comment, let me know, and give me some ideas for things to talk about. Okay, so let's jump into what we're going to do tonight and start taking a look at this. So this is the preview that you might have seen tonight that I did a render of my current scene. And it's just a part of the current scene, but it's got a lot of the weathering and surface details that I'm gonna be talking about tonight with Blender and Substance. And so we've got a basic amber sort of fossil. There's an object inside of it. It's got cracks and all sorts of stuff. And I'm gonna briefly talk about the workflow that I used to get it to this point. And then we're gonna talk about how to add wear and tear and stuff like that on some other objects. So this is kind of what you can see on this. We've got dust added. There's even fingerprints that you may or may not be able to see from your perspective, but they're there, which is really, really cool. And Substance makes it very, very easy to add this sort of stuff. So if you've never done this before, this is gonna be a super awesome introduction to that kind of stuff. So let me open up Blender and let me kind of show you about where we're at with the current project. And let's get into everything tonight. So I've been working on this project for the past month or so. There's quite a bit going on at this point, but it is very, very cool. So this weekend, I spent some time getting in here and totally making sure that I had almost all the surfaces completely UV unwrapped and got that going. Not sure if I can start a render without things crashing on me, but let me see if I can start a cycles render just so you guys can see what it looks like as I rotate around in cycles. It's kind of a big scene, so don't know if this is gonna work, but let's see if we can get it going. Okay, so you can see here, I've turned off a lot of the lights in the background, so they're not visible to the camera, but you can see as I rotate around that we're in cycles, and I've got an HDR in the background that I custom made, and then I've also got a lot of lamps around the scene that are helping kind of get things lit up correctly. So if I let this resolve for a few seconds, it'll start to clear up and you guys can see what some of those details look like. Most of this started off in Blender, and I wasn't planning on getting a lot into Substance when I started the scene off, but it became necessary when I wanted to do a lot more advanced texturing. So let's talk about the process for one of these objects. And we'll talk about the fossil tonight. And so I'm gonna isolate this, but first I'm gonna see if I have my backup object. Okay, here we go. So this is the original object that I created in one of my other courses that you may have seen. And so this was a fossil that was constructed there, and it's very, very messy, got a lot of bad topology because it was created using some interesting techniques, which you guys can see in my Blender Mastering Subdivision Surface Modeling course, if you're interested in that. But it left me with some really rough geometry. So I found out that as I got further and further into rendering this, that it was adding quite a bit of polys to my scene, and I wanted to optimize that for texturing. So what I did was I went ahead and re-topologized with this mesh, and I basically recreated using a basic sphere and a shrink wrap modifier to create this topology. And then I went ahead and UV unwrapped this with a couple of seams to create a flatter layout. So if we jump into the UV image preview, I can highlight all of this and kind of show you guys where this is at. So this is sort of where the unwrap ended up. And if I switch into textured view, you can kind of get a preview for what this is looking like with the unwrap. And so the goal here was to get the UV preview image wrapped onto this where there isn't really any distortion going on. We've got a basic, generally the same size squares over the whole thing. And so what I like about this type of color mapping with all these numbers and letters is that even if you can't always tell that the squares are perfectly even, you can really start to tell with the letters and numbers if things are getting too stretched or squashed. And so I like that a lot. And the bottom isn't really seen, so I did a sort of separate disconnected unwrap for that. But it is basically been brought in with a 1K texture. And to get this over to Substance, it's really, really simple. What I did was, once I had this UV unwrapped, I went in and saved an OBJ of the low-res object, and that's what I used in Substance. So it looks like we got a question over in the chat. Lauren, good to see you tonight. She's asking, why could you have not decimated the original fossil rather than redoing it? And the reason for that, for this particular setup, is because we were going to need to do a texture map with UVs for baking. And so if I look up the normal map for this under fossil normals, you can see, if this will let me update, that I baked that high-res detail from the original fossil into the normals, and the original crack is not in the low-res object because that would have taken up a lot of extra polys. So that's why we had to recreate a low-res version. I'm also saving quite a few polys. So this is only about 1,400, or actually 700 edges or faces for the low-res object, whereas the high-res object had 30 to 50,000, somewhere in there. And so we're saving quite a bit of geometry. And you can just imagine if you do this to every object in your scene, you're really going to be cutting down on polys, because with the pipe that I did by itself, we get out of the local view here and I switch to the third layer. I actually have to keep this on a separate layer right now because I haven't retopologized it yet, and it's such a dense object. But this is something that you may have noticed from some of the other streams that we just got finished wrapping up. It's just been sculpted, and so it's very, very dense. There's almost 30 million polys in this one object because it has tons of detail on this. And so the next step for this object is going to be what I was just talking about. We're going to retopologize, rebuild a low-res mesh on top of this, and then all of this detail is going to be baked out into a normal map and brought into Substance Painter so that I can dirty this up and create some age. But this is going to take quite a bit of time to retopologize because of all the detail, and also there is not any symmetry on this object. So other than the pipe stem, we've got pretty asymmetrical objects to deal with, and so that's going to add a little bit of time for the retopo. So let's get back to our other objects. So to save this for Substance, once you have an UV unwrapped object, in my particular case, I baked the normals in Blender before I went to Substance, but you don't have to do that as long as you have a high-res and a low-res object. But you can go to Export, go to the Wavefront OBJ, which is what I've been using. And then the only thing I really had to change was make sure that you have selection only checked off and that your object is selected when you try to export it. And then I just saved this as fossil OBJ. It's a pretty small file size. You can see here, only 87 kilobytes. And let's open up our file in Substance and talk a little bit about how we got to where we are now. So I'm going to jump back into my textures folder for this project. And you can see I've created separate folders for each of the main objects in my scene at this point because they all have Substance files and separate Photoshop files attached. And so if we go into the fossil directory, I can just load up this fossil file here into Substance Painter, and it will kind of show you what I ended up doing. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the differences in the way that I've been working on this scene versus a typical PBR-based scene. If you're familiar with the Substance Painter, Substance Designer workflow, you may be familiar with the idea of physically based rendering, physically based shading. In this particular case, I'm not using the PBR workflow that is strictly metal rough or spec specular glossy workflow because I am kind of custom making my shaders in Blender. So I'm going to show you how I got around and get some usable files out of Substance Painter for that. So the first step in creating this project was to make sure that the project configuration was set to using a different kind of shader than normal. So typically you're going to see in Substance that you're going to be using a metallic rough or a specular glossy that is here. But for this particular shader, for this image or this object, I wanted to use a non-PBR specular rough, I think is what it is. Let me see if I can find it. There it is. So a specular gloss. So this will basically give you sort of a different version of the shader that's a little bit non-PBR to work on. And so you're not going to see any of the transparency or anything like that because this particular shader doesn't support that, but I didn't really need it to start painting the details onto this object. And so if I kind of break this down, it's pretty simple. We have a basic amber fill layer that was just me picking a color for the diffuse. And then that filled the entire object with this basic color. And it was just so that I could get a basic reference point for what the clean version looked like. You'll notice that the normals are already brought in and baked in. So if I go to my texture set settings, and then I check under my mesh maps, my normal map was imported from Blender right here. So you can see that. And that's also under my project here. If you don't have your normal map that you baked out from Blender, all you have to do is go to File, Import Resources, and then go to Add Resources, pick your file, and then you need to decide what kind of image format it is. So you can pick texture, environment, color, LUT, alpha, and so texture is what you want. And then you're going to decide where you want to import your resources down here. So I just put this under my current project. That's going to load it into here, which makes it visible to the rest of your settings. And so now if you just go into any of these, you can pick any of your custom maps from this pop-up right here. So I just picked normal map. And this is an OpenGL-based normal map from Blender. And I picked that and loaded it into the normals channel for this model. And then it gave me that crack added back. And so now when I rotate the lighting, you can see that it kind of updates what that looks like. And all I did was I added a dust on top of this. And so I used a very easy smart mask to create this dust. And so you can go ahead and grab edges dusty. And there's some other things here. This is dust occluded. If you want this in the cracks of your model, you can add that. And there's quite a few dust sort of things here. So I think I picked something like dust dirty. Or maybe there's the simple dust like this that I added by itself, but it's going to start you off in the right direction. And so if I turn some of this off, you can see I've got two separate major layers for the dust. And I have one that's got just big clumps of dust and really bright specks on the object. For this, you can go into the base layer here and make some adjustments, or you can get into the sub editors here. Now, I think I had to add these paint layers. So you're gonna do the ratio dirt fill by itself. This is gonna automatically come in with a texture for you. And all you really have to do is play with these sliders to affect how much dust is on your object. And so that's the great thing about Substance Painter is that it's gonna speed up that process for you. And the same thing for this one. If I turn that on and turn the bottom layer off, we have another mask editor here, which again, I can adjust with this slider. And so the only thing that I changed on these two layers to give it more of a custom flair was I added a paint layer. And so if you start with a brush or something and it doesn't have a paint layer and you try to start painting, it'll ask you if you want to add one, or you can just right click and say add a paint layer. And once you have a paint layer, you can basically start painting in and out these details. And so once I had this up and I wanted to pick something like dirt spots, I can rotate into a position on my model here, make sure the lighting is in a way that's gonna give me some information to paint with. And then I can adjust my brush settings. And once I'm on the paint layer, I can start painting here. And whether I'm painting with black or white will control whether it's adding or removing this dust. And so depending on how much you want to grunge things up, you've got a lot of different brush options for the way to get in here and add stuff to your models. I recommend doing it in a lot of passes and layers. And if you're not going to add a lot of layers, one of the other techniques would be to turn your stroke opacity down really, really low. And then you can just start caking this up little by little. And you want to kind of rotate your light around, rotate around your model, and give yourself some various angles to paint from. But that's going to give you a lot of customization options for this. So you change brushes often, change your settings to give a lot of randomness and variation. And then at some point down the road, you'd want to start thinking about how to add in things like fingerprints and stuff like that. And in the Substance, this is really, really fun, really, really easy, and really, really cool because there's a fingerprints brush right here. So you just jump down to the fingerprints, pick the size that you want, and obviously you can rotate this or change anything. It's going to come in with a jitter turned on, which means it's going to kind of randomly place these all over your objects in different positions. And all I did was I picked a good jitter. I turned the opacity down quite a bit for this so that when I did it, it was going to kind of add these a little bit at a time. But you don't want to go overboard, but it's a great way to add that little human touch to your dirty models there. So we've got a question from I Love to Eat Off in the chat. It says, is Substance Painter something you would consider a must buy for a 3D artist? I would say no. I'd say it totally depends on your workflow. If you're going to be doing real-time assets, it's going to be something that can really help you save a lot of time because there are a lot of ways to create textures and shaders, whether you're talking about Blender or any other kind of 3D modeling package. But if you're going to want to get into game design or real-time graphics or VR, AR, things like that, then Substance is kind of what everybody uses. It's fairly cheap. It's about $25 a month for all 3 programs or so that you get with the Substance Live subscription. And I'd say it's a good buy if you have the money to spend. Which if you're going to be doing this, seriously, then it would be something I would look at investing in because it's going to really save you enough time to kind of pay for itself as you go. So it's not the easiest thing to learn in the world right off the bat, but I picked it up in a few months, and there's a lot of tutorials online, including on my channel, that can kind of walk you through the basics. So no, you don't have to buy it. There's plenty of ways to do things procedurally and cycles if you want to do that instead. But it's the same thing that I say to people that ask me, should I buy Photoshop? Should I buy Adobe products? And I say, well, how much are you doing and what does it look like for certain projects? Because if you spend all of your time, painting textures or something that's going to take you a lot of time, and there's a faster way to do something in Photoshop than in something like GIMP, then it's kind of a no-brainer. I mean, why not spend the money and buy Photoshop? Now, I know a lot of people watching, maybe students, may not have the money, but they do have a lot of options that are affordable for students that I would recommend getting into. I don't recommend, just trying to go with the 100% free route forever, because I think you're going to be missing out on a lot of really fun stuff, even when it just comes to Blender, because even with just add-ons, there's a lot of amazing add-ons that are starting to come out for Blender that are going to cost you a little bit of money, but it's totally worth it to get into that if that's what you need to do your art. Yeah, let's get into some of the rest of the stuff now. So this is the basic idea for how I created this object. And tonight I want to kind of walk through a little bit about how to spice things up a little bit and talk about another object we're going to dirty up, because not all of the objects in my scene have been dirtied up yet. So let's jump back over to this file, and I'm going to bring up my latest render so you guys can see where this ended up. This was from this past weekend. Let me jump into my test renders folder here. Got a lot of test renders now. So bear with me 1 second while I pull this up in Photoshop. And let's make this full screen. Okay, so you guys can see I did quite a bit this weekend to update the scene so far. Some of the objects have been worked on and they've been almost finalized with some dirt and grunge. The desk has been completely painted in Substance. The leather texture, I think I did kind of in Blender, and I used a little bit of Substance Designer to help me with that. But all of the leather was pretty much done in cycles procedurally, apart from the little bumps. And the wood, I finally got done in Substance, which was really, really fast and easy to do. Because they have built-in wood. So I've dirtied up the fossil like I just told you about, and everything else except for the journal has pretty much not been touched yet with dirt and grime. And so almost all of the objects are unwrapped. If we want to tackle one in particular, except for the pipe, I can do tonight. So if you guys have any opinions on what you'd like me to kind of work on dirtying up, let me know, and we can do that in Substance. There's a couple of areas which I'm going to pick out tonight to talk specifically about how to add in some of the finishing touches. We're getting pretty close to getting finished with this 3D illustration. I'm not 100% satisfied with the lighting, and there's one big object in the center that we are missing, but I'm actually saving that for the 3D illustration course that's coming up. So the only way to see that is if you purchase the 3D illustration course or become a member of the Orange Guild, but that is coming up soon. So any opinions you guys have tonight, let me know in the chat, and we can talk about specifically how to dirty up one particular object and what I might do to do that. Ideas I have currently are some other things I might add on the fossil over here on this little amber object to add some more realism. The pristine glass sugar dish right here has not been touched at all, which really needs to be kind of dusted up a little bit. I did this doily this weekend to put underneath, which was kind of an interesting project, something I'd never done before, but that was kind of a fun thing to work on. And you can see how clean the rest of the stuff is behind here, so we're going to need to play with that as well. We might chip up some of the china. That might be something we can do here, but let me know if you guys have something in the chat you want me to work on. Let's do it. Okay, so right away, a really simple thing that I can do to kind of grunge up some of this stuff in the fossil, or not grunge up, but add some more realism, is air bubbles. So I was looking at some reference before, and I realized I completely forgot about that aspect of it, but there would be probably some air bubbles inside of this object. So let's talk about how to really quickly add these in, and it's really not hard at all. So we're just going to solo this object. I'm going to edit mode, and you can see how simple this is. There's really nothing inside. It's just a big flat half sphere. Somebody in the chat, Lorian is saying, please work on the saucer. What is the design on the saucer? I'll jump into that. I'll show you what I did. I actually hand painted that in Photoshop, and then I brought that into Substance, so we'll go over that workflow. But first, let's talk about how to add these air bubbles. So what I'm going to do is just add a very basic icosphere to this model. I'm in edit mode right now. So if I kind of jump into side view here, all we're going to do is shrink this down really, really small. It can be an icosphere with a lot of edges because it's so small you're not really going to notice that it's very kind of sharp. So all we would really need to do is to make sure that we smooth the edges. So we can jump into the shading and UVs tab, and then for the faces we can just hit smooth there. And what we can do now is if we jump into the properties tab over here, I want to show the normals on this mesh. And so let's jump down to the normal section and turn on the face normals. You'll notice that all the normals on this bubble are pointing out. And that's a problem in this case because we want this air bubble to be empty space. We basically want it to be where the amber stops, and then there's going to be a hollow piece of air in the middle, and then the amber continues on the other side of the bubble. And so because this is all technically one object, we want the normals to be facing inside because it is a gap in the other model, which means that if you were going to cut this in half where that air bubble is, that if that was one continuous wall, those normals would be the other side of the wall. So they would be facing the other way. So to flip these, all you have to do is go to Tools, and you can go down to, actually this is under Shading and UVs in edit mode. can go to flip direction on the normals, and you can see that those are now all facing on the inside of that circle or the sphere. So I'm going to turn this back off so those are disappearing. And now we're just going to duplicate this object around the inside of our little amber fossil here. And I'm going to scale these at sort of different sizes and heights so that we're getting some random variation here. And what you want to do is create some clusters. And so there's going to be big bubbles, and then around the big bubbles, you're going to have tiny little bubbles that are kind of like orbiting those in a planetary way. And that's how you get more sort of realistic air bubbles there. Little trick there. So let me scale this one down. This one will make really tiny. And again, just occasionally rotate and make sure you're kind of changing position so you're not lining these all up in one row. We'll just do that. So I'm gonna try to quickly get these kind of locked into place. And I'm gonna actually isolate these to sort of one big section. That way we're not putting these everywhere inside. If you had more time and you wanted to, you could obviously duplicate these all over the entire thing, depending on what kind of look you're going for. But in our case, I'm just gonna want to kind of add a few here and there. So we see that. And each of the big ones is going to have a little bit of a variation on how many of the small bubbles are around it. It's hard to see in wireframe mode, like exactly what's going on. So you want to make sure that if you're going to do it in wireframe mode that you keep rotating, because it's hard to tell how close things are from each other. You'll also notice that every time we duplicate one of these, we're adding some polygons to our model here. So now that we're looking at how many polys are in this, we've already back up to almost 2,100 polys. So just keep an eye on that and make sure you're not going too overboard with what you're doing here. And that will make it easier to manage and maintain. So we also don't want these to look sort of uniform. So let's kind of rotate how these are clustered a little bit and make these a little different looking there. Okay. So Lorian's asking, how can you tell that all the bubbles are inside the fossil? And so the quickest way is if you turn back on solid view, you're not going to be able to see them floating around the outside. And as I rotate around, you can actually see them floating around inside. So if you don't want to have to mess with the wireframe of the outside mesh, you could just hit L to select all of the linked faces on the outside, hit H to hide those, and then you would have just your air bubbles to deal with. But then you would want to make sure that you actually have them placed inside when you go back into shaded view and unhide, because they need to be inside. So we are almost done here. Let's make sure that we try to get as much random variation as possible. Okay, now these are too far in towards the middle. I want these to be a little bit more towards the surface, because now that we have so much distortion from the index of refraction on the glass shader and also the dust on the surface, it's going to be harder to see these than it used to be. So we don't want these to be just hovering around in the middle, because it's kind of a waste of a detail. We want these to be where we can actually see them. So obviously, the more time you have to kind of play with, see this one went outside, so we're gonna have to move that down inside. To play with the positioning of these, the more realistic it's gonna look, and that's what we're going for. Real randomness in nature is hard to replicate in 3D graphics, because it's so easy to line things up and make them perfect without thinking about it, that you really have to work at sort of making things look messy. Even now I can see like this sort of looks like a line. It's in a U shape, and I didn't even mean to do that. So from this point of view, we want to fix that. Even if it just means taking one thing and putting it out of place, it helps. So still doesn't feel random enough. Let's cluster some of these a lot closer together, and then we'll make that look a little bit like it's part of this bigger shape over here, something like this. And for the most part, I want these to be pretty symmetrical and not distort them, because most air bubbles are going to be naturally formed, and so they're not going to be crushed or distorted or look weird, because they would have just naturally happened in this molten state. So once again, let's cluster one of these kind of closer to the other one. And I don't want to add tons, I just want to add enough to be noticeable in the render, but don't want to spend a lot of time on this because I have some other stuff I want to get into tonight. Okay, so that's enough to be noticeable. So let's jump back out of local view. I've got a camera set up separate from my render camera that is on this layer that is over here. And actually, no, it's not. Where is it? Is that on another layer? Let's see. Anyways, set up over here. So let's turn on all of our lights and make sure we have our render settings set to something that will not take forever. So I'm going to turn my samples back down over here to something manageable. Let's say something like 200. And let's give this a render right about here. Okay, so hopefully you'll be able to see these kind of right underneath the surface, kind of peeking through. And so Timothy in the chat is asking, would particles work faster for this part? Depending on how many you were going to add, it might. And so that can be a definite possibility for how you would go about doing this. I didn't want to have to go to the trouble to set up a bunch of particle system configuration and settings for all of that. So I skipped it at this point. But yeah, that is another way to do this. So yeah, you can kind of see right underneath the surface, right down here, we've got some of these bubbles popping up. They're really subtle, but if I do a really, really big render for the final that people can zoom in on, it's going to be noticeable that these are there. And this is where we start getting into how to make these illustrations towards the final steps really, really effective, because most people will get halfway to where this one has gotten and they'll just give up and they'll say, well, I'm sick of working on it. I'm done. You know, I've spent too many days, too many weeks working on this. But the trick to getting really realistic results, and if I zoom in here, you can see a couple of these air bubbles right here, is to take the time to do these little things, because you have layers of details. So somebody that first comes upon your render, whether it's on Facebook, ArtStation, whatever, they're going to stop because the whole thing looks good from a distance. And then hopefully you're going to get them to click on it, zoom in, and they're going to start picking out individual objects. And the idea is the further they zoom in on, you know, or they focus on a particular area of an object, they should be able to see layer after layer after layer of detail. And if you can get to a point where you know where to add those layers in the right places, then you'll be able to successfully create any sort of kind of 3D illustration that you want. So that's the first thing I would kind of do to add a little bit of a finishing touch for that object. But Lorian's talking about the saucer, which is over here. I've got all of these kind of parented right now, so these are separate objects. But let me jump in and show you how I created the texture for this. So if I jump into texture view right now, you can see that all of the objects in here are UV unwraps, and I've created an image in each of these cycle shaders that is pointing to a UV map. So each of these is showing up as the colored UV section that you have here. But if we look at the saucer material here, and I jump into the node editor, you can see that I've kind of started organizing things a little bit more. First, we have the base material, then we have the painted on details, and then after that, we have what I would call the surface glaze, which is the shiny part of the saucer. And so most of the china is all based on this one idea. So this is all grouped into a china material that I can reuse over and over again. And then, like I said, each of these has a separate image texture, which has this UV map, this color-coded UV map inside of it. And that way, anytime I switch into this textured view, it's going to show me that, which is good because it gives me an idea of what I have left to do to texture. So these are actually also textured, but the image texture has to be selected for this to show up as a UV image texture in the actual material here. So I had these grouped, these three grouped originally. I don't actually need this material on the stamp, so I'm going to get rid of those two. So I just have the stamp and then make sure I have that selected. For the ticket, I'm going to do the same thing. And this was just an easy thing for me to do so that I could have all of these under one UV map. And then the postcard has already got its selected, but it doesn't need to have these other two textures. So let's get rid of that. Okay, there we go. So what I'm gonna do now is go ahead and save a new version. You'll notice I'm up to version number 12 for the scene. We're getting some pretty high file sizes. I'm up to over 2.5 gigs at this point for one scene file. And most of that's because the pipe has not been retopoed yet, so there's a lot of geometry there to keep up with. Okay, so if we look at the saucer here, let's jump back into the node editor, and I'm gonna grab the diffuse texture, which has the painted on details. And switch back to the 3D view, and you'll see here we zoom in, we have all these details that I did in Substance Painter. Now the flower, I actually painted that in Photoshop, and so if we want to jump into Photoshop real fast, I can show you what that looks like big. So pull this up. We got Miss Anthropy in the chat asking, what do the letters and symbols mean? So I think you're talking about on the UV map, and those have no particular purpose other than to show you distortion and stretching. So it just goes A through Z in one direction, A through Z in another direction. And with those there, you can tell what's next to each other and how the seams line up and all that sort of stuff in the UV map. So this was just a hand-painted thing that I did in Photoshop. Really, really simple. I got some reference that I pulled over. You can see remnants of it here in this little clip that I got, and this is what I kind of used for basic reference for how the hand-painted look was supposed to be on like a vase. And then I created my own custom design and just did this with basic painting techniques in Photoshop. I used a new tool that is now in Photoshop called the mixer brush. And I'm not sure how new this is, but I had really never used it before until last weekend. And basically what it allows you to do is really easily blend two colors. And so if I grab this color here, let me get my tablet real fast so you guys can see what this looks like. See Miss Anthropy saying, ooh, the flower is lovely. Thank you very much. This was a fun little texture to do. And so we want to grab our regular paintbrush first. Let's grab a brush. I'm going to use one of my brushes. Let's use the one we created a couple of weeks ago. Let's color pick this blue, and then we'll color pick this dark navy. And you can see what happens if we grab the mixer brush. You've got all these settings. You got wet, dry, all these different kinds of loads in terms of how much paint and ink and stuff is in your brush. You've got settings such as whether the brush is cleaned after every single stroke you make on the canvas, whether or not the brush is loaded with the same color after every single stroke. These affect how the mixing works. Then you've got all of the options in terms of how wet or dry, how much load is in the brush, mix factor, how much flow, and then just all sorts of stuff that you can play with in terms of how this works. But basically, the idea is you can just really quickly blend between two colors. And it's really easy to fade between these, which is exactly the effect you would get if you were painting on a real canvas. So let's talk about how to apply the design to the saucer, which is the next question in the chat. So once I had this, all I did is I saved this out in its own image file. You can see right here, it has an alpha, which allows it to be transparent. So you can kind of see that. If I put a background behind it, you can kind of see this a little better. Let's make this black. So yeah, so the flower by itself has an alpha with transparency. All I did was to bring this in. Let me open up my my saucer substance painter file here, so you can see what this looks like. And it's really a shame that you can't see all the details because things have to be covered up in the final scene because it's stacked on top of other stuff. But I've got like even a little fleur-de-lis painted underneath on the bottom, and went to a lot of trouble to get a lot of these details in here. But let me talk about how this works. So for basic stamping, which is what I did to put this flower on the side over here, I had to import that file. And it's the same thing that we just talked about in terms of the normal map. So if we go to the project settings, you can see that I pulled this in as a file. So once again, all you have to do is go to File, Import Resources, add a resource. And in this case, I went to where the original flower was, which was on the teacup. So if we go to the teacup folder, you can see that I've got the hand painted flower there. I just hit open, tell it that it's a texture, and then tell it where to go. So project, there it goes. So this came in like this, then I can pick it once I have it brush. So for this, I wanted a hard surface edge brush so that it could stamp pretty evenly without any faded edges. And then once I have that, if I go back here and grab my hand painted texture, all you need to do is go into the brush settings. And you can do this a couple of ways. You can do this under the alpha, which will change the shape of it based on what you pick here. So you'd have to clear this and then put another one of these in here. It's not going to work because it only really works with the black and white images for the alpha. So you would actually need to use a stencil in this case. So if I go back to the brushes, pick my basic hard brush, then you're going to see that if we pick a brush here, and then I go under stencil, I can pick anything I want really. This would bring it in and let you paint using a projection technique. And so I could line my plate up with where I wanted this flower to go, and then I could paint the flower onto the plate using the stencil that way. You would need to pick a color obviously for that, and then that would let you line the flower up with how that works. So I didn't use that method for this particular thing. What I did was I used the diffuse channel. So just load that under the diffuse channel, and now whatever brush you have selected will keep its alpha and maintain that in terms of the outer shape of the brush. And then the inside, it'll use this color under the image that you imported under the diffuse channel. And so now that I have this, I can change the size of this, change the rotation any way that I want, and then I can just stamp this onto the plate. And that's going to go straight into the diffuse map, which you can see under the image map here. And those are all added straight into the correct channels. And in order to wrap this evenly around the plates, what I had to do was UV unwrap my plate so that the outer edges were in a straight line. And then all I had to do was paint this pattern in a straight line using this technique. And so I would just change the spacing so that it's wider apart, and then pick the right size. And then to create a straight line, you just start in one side, hold shift and control to keep it straight, and then finish on the other side, and it paints that straight line all the way across. Now, one thing you're gonna have to pay attention to as you do this is your projection settings on your brush. So if you look at the alignment and the size space here, you've got tangent, wrap, tangent planar, UV, and camera. So typically I think this is under tangent wrap for when you're painting in the 3D viewport. If you're going to paint in the UV space, you want to change this to UV so that it's going to keep this flat and not distort it. And then you're going to want to change your size so that it's not based on the object coordinates, but it's based on the texture coordinates. And so this will let you pick a size for the thing that you're going to be painting with, and then that will stay constant. And so now when you paint, you can click once to start a line, move your mouse over to where you want it to end, hold Control and Shift, and then left click again. And based on your spacing here, it will decide how far apart to put those. So that's exactly how I did that. That's how I did the dots. That's how I made these perfectly straight lines all the way across. And for objects that were more circular, I actually found a brush that helped me accomplish this. There's actually an alpha. Yeah, this double circle alpha that you can see down here. If I make this a little bigger, this double circle alpha let me paint this sort of big ring around the inside edge. So you don't always have to unwrap this straight across in the UVs, but it helps. So UV refers to, that's no problem. So let's talk a little bit about UVs if you've never heard of these. UVs is basically referring to a UV map, and a UV map is a two-dimensional flattening of a three-dimensional object's mesh on a 2D surface. And so basically we're telling a program like Photoshop, or in this case Substance Painter, how to apply a texture that we're painting back onto a 3D surface. And so think about if you have a cardboard box that has tape on the sides, and you tape that flat cardboard box up into a box so that you can move stuff from one place to another. If you were to take a knife and cut those pieces of packing tape off and flatten the box back down, that's exactly what a UV map does. Is it gives you a way to represent what you need all at one time on a flat surface for the whole object in one single map. And that map is called a UV map. And they're actually UV coordinates. And so rather than X and Y, like you would have on a basic 3D graph or 2D graph, you've got U and V coordinates that represent U and V on the UV map. So that's basically how I went in and did that. Now I didn't actually add the grunge, so let's get into that. I've got my decals on a separate layer. Let's switch back to a hybrid 2D, 3D view here. And you'll notice that I'm also still not using the metallic rough workflow. To do this, I went File, New, and let's talk about how I would create a new project for an asset I haven't started yet. So in this case, we've got options, and typically if you're going to work on a real-time asset for a game, or even an Eevee, the new rendering engine for Blender, you would pick a metallic rough workflow, or you would pick a specular glossy workflow right here. That's going to set Substance Painter up to use the proper shader and rendering engine for that workflow. Now, in my case, I'm not using the principled shader or anything like that in Cycles. I'm building all my own custom shaders. And so for this workflow to kind of be a little easier for me to do with Substance, I'm using the non-PBR specular glossy thing here. Now, that's not 100% necessary, but it's what I decided to use. It makes it just a little simpler for me to keep that straight in my head because I'm not having to mess with metallic rough maps or anything like that. So I just picked non-PBR, specular glossy. Obviously, you're going to need to select your model that you want to work on. And so in this case, if we pick like the sugar dish, that's an object that I haven't actually done yet. So we can pick that. And then if we go to our normal map format, we want to use OpenGL because that's what Blender uses. And then we want to pick our document resolution. So for objects that aren't going to get a lot of screen space on the final render, I don't want to go super high res. So for the fossil, I only did a 1024 by 1024 map. For a bigger object, I've been sticking with 2K for the kinds of maps that have a lot of detail. So the money and things like that have a lot of picture information, I'm using a 2K map. And for things that are not getting a lot of detail, you obviously wouldn't want to go up this high res. But I think the desk is a 4096, a 4K texture. The journal might be because it's got so much taken up in the final render. But in this case, let's say we use a 1024. And if you have any other like normal maps that you've already baked, you would obviously want to bring those in at this point, but I don't. So now we can hit OK. It's going to say, it's going to bring that in as long as you've got the proper OBJ created. So let's see. I think it's still loading. Let's give it a chance to catch up. I'm not actually sure how high res the sugar dish was. Let me check that real fast. Yeah, so that sugar dish is pretty big. You can see the saucer we were just opening was only 3 megabytes. This one's 54, and that's because I didn't actually retopo this object. So this could take a minute to kind of load in. If you notice that it isn't loading, you want to check your settings here and make sure that you have everything set up. I'm not seeing project settings. So let me go ahead and save this in the right folder, and let's see what we can get going here. Okay, save our substance file. That should give us access. Okay, so I'm not sure why that's not working. Let's go ahead and close this real fast, and then we will reopen and see what's going on. It's weird. It's not wanting to save that. So I'm going to discard this, and let's reopen. Sometimes Substance asks a little weird. Okay, so let's start a new project again. Pick non-PBR, OpenGL. Let's do a 1024 is fine. And once again, let's select our sugar dish. Okay, still didn't work. So let's go into Blender and see if we can actually troubleshoot what's going on here. I'm going to switch into a separate file. So I'm going to save what I have. I'm going to create a new Blender file to just load in the OBJ by itself. And then we're going to kind of troubleshoot and see what's happening. It could be anything right now. I'm not really sure what's going on, but let's re-import this OBJ that I exported. And in this case, I want to go back to this folder, pick the sugar dish object. Let's hit import. And let's see if Blender will let us pull it in. Okay, so right off the bat, I noticed that the object's origin is not in the center of the object. It's off to the side. So to reposition this, I'm going to use Control-Shift-Alt-C, and I'm going to select origin to geometry, and it's going to place it right in the middle of the object. And now we need to place this back in the center of our world. So let us reposition all of the X, Y, and Z coordinates. I'm going to apply the rotation and scale so that it is all zeroed back out. And now let's once again hit File, Exports, OBJ, Selection Only. And then I want to go and replace this file that I have here, sugar dish OBJ. It's going to take a second to export again. So another question in the chat, is the Atlantean emulate a video game that you're making? No, I'm actually just creating a 3D illustration. I had planned this for a long time and hadn't really had a chance to work on it. But I'm very excited about the process of finishing it because it's been over a year that I've wanted to kind of work on this. Okay, so just so that we get a clean start, non-PBR, you guys are going to have this memorized by heart. OpenGL 1024 for the map resolution. Let's select our sugar dish object again, and hopefully this will work this time. There we go. Okay. All right, so we've got a couple of things here. One of the menus that typically is showing, I've gone ahead and gotten rid of, but let's go ahead and open it again so you guys can see that. We've got a Windows view. We've got the texture set list. Pull that up. Now, this is going to assign separate texture sets to the number of shaders that you save out of Blender. And so in this particular case, I had one for the blue glass, and then I had one just for this like sterling silver ring around the outside. And so what's great is if you have these separated, it will let you turn these on and off. And so if I'm just going to work on the shiny silver ring on the top, I can hide the rest of it, and we'll kind of speed up the viewport a little bit. And also to work on these different layer stacks, you need to make sure you have the right one selected because it will have separate layer stacks. Lauren's asking, so the displacement of the sugar dish in Blender caused it not to open in Substance? No, actually, I think it was opening. It's just that it was putting it off to the side because our origin wasn't centered in the right location. Also, I had forgotten to apply the rotation was set at a 9-degree rotation on the x-axis, and also the scale I don't think was set to 1, 1, and 1. And so you need to make sure that all of those settings are set back to the defaults when you export an object to something like Substance, because it's going to use those settings when it imports. And so it probably imported way out over here somewhere, and I didn't see it. So let's start talking about how to work a little bit on something like this. And I'm actually going to jump back over to the sugar or the saucer, because that's actually what Lauren wanted me to work on. So let me save this one, but now you guys know how to create a new project. Let's open the saucer back up. Okay, now the saucer has two settings as well, because you'll notice this outside ring that's kind of black in this case, that's actually like a silver metallic ring that's been put on this plate. So if I turn this off, you'll see it disappears. It's still, the plate's still there, it's just that this outside ring is gone. And then the China obviously has its own separate thing. So the China has the decals, and then again, you see if I switch to the sterling silver, it's got its own separate materials here that I've created right there. So let's talk about how to really quickly kind of grunge this up just a little bit. I'm gonna X out of the texture list there. So the first thing I always hit if I'm gonna be using just native Substance materials is the materials tab over here, or the smart materials tab, because the smart materials tab will actually already have the masks included in the material. And so it's going to save you a lot of time if you really just quickly want to throw something on and kind of get going. And what's great is it already comes bundled with quite a lot of stuff. So we've got fabric materials that you can see over here. There's leather, you've got metal, obviously. And so you just want to pick something that kind of gets you in a good starting position. And you can always change colors and all that stuff as you go, but this helps. There's even a smart material for dust over here that you can add right there. And so we might start with this. Let's just drag this over and above the decals and drop that in. You're going to see that automatically adds a little bit of dust here on the plate. It's kind of hard to tell like what's there, but let's expand this little drop down folder over here, and let's click on some of these right down here. You're going to have a color for the dust. And so if we don't want this dust to be kind of yellowish, we can actually see these a lot better if we zoom in on the 2-dimensional image map here. If we don't want this to be sort of yellow, we want it to be a little bit more, less saturated and white or something like that. We can change that there. We got the same dust base material over here is sort of yellowish, so we can change that as well. Make it a little darker. Now I don't want to add a lot of dust on the plate because that would, seem to not make a lot of sense since it's kind of being used, and it would be kind of disgusting. So what we're going to want to do instead is add something more like water spots, maybe some discoloration on the surface, things like that. This all goes back to making sure that you're kind of aligning your vision for the story with the decisions you're making for the design and the wear and things like that, because it would be easy to come in here and just overwork it in one area. And if it doesn't match the purpose of the story, you obviously don't want to do that. So think it through a little bit and then get in here and decide what you need to do. So Miss Anthropy says, imagine a saucer made of fabric. We can actually do that real fast if you want to see what it looks like. Totally possible. Let's throw leather on the bottom here. And there we go. We've got a leather plate. And if you want, you can play a lot with this sort of stuff. We've got a gold plate. Throw that under there. Now, because I'm using the non-metallic rough workflow, it's giving some weird effects for metallic stuff. They're seeming kind of black, but typically this would not look this way if you were using the metallic rough or specular glossy workflow. But yeah, there's a lot of fun stuff. We have a camo plate. Drop that in there. Bam, there we go. Ready for the military. So yeah, that's fun. So now you can see why I use Substance, because if I was trying to do that in Blender, you can imagine how long it would take me to hand do that procedurally in cycles. Now, there's ways to speed that up with add-ons for saving your materials and things like that, but still, Substance, there's thousands of these online that you can get as part of being a member for their Substance subscription. So why not just use the resource, because it's there. So let's see, dust might be something we could play with still. We need to tweak this. So what we would want to do is either add a paint layer or some sort of adjustment like a levels to dial this back, because this is a little too heavy right here. So you guys can see this a little better. I'm gonna actually lower this down to sort of like a blacker color, and that way you guys can see what these are doing. So this one, I'm gonna make sort of a, let's make it like a color that you guys can see, hopefully. Yeah, let's make this like red. So I'm not even seeing where this is showing up right now on the plate, but let's add a paint layer and see where we can add some. So once we get a paint layer on there, we can go to brush. We can get a soft brush here, and then we can just kind of paint on what this looks like. And it should start showing up in the mask wherever this is going on, but I'm actually not seeing what's happening here. So let's add another paint layer down here and see if there's any difference with the way this is working. So once again, make sure we're under UV. I'm gonna go texture here. Okay, my hardness was down, so that may have affected a little bit of this. So yeah, now I'm adding and removing, and just by switching colors on the keyboard with the X command, the same as in Photoshop, switching between black and white, we can change what we're painting with here on this. So you can see hitting X switches from the grayscale down here from black to white as I hit this on the keyboard. So you'll see here it is. The effect is not paintable, create a paint effect. And so we have to hit that. For this one, it already had a dirt layer down here. And so we could actually use this to help drive what this looks like once again. So here we can add a lot more. This will let you play with the contrast. And this will change how random this is, this disorder effect. So now we can get it really disgusting looking. So again, once you have a paintbrush, again, adding back and forth like this, you can play with this a little bit. I'm gonna go ahead and get rid of that on this layer. And it looks like there may be something affecting the center of this here that we already painted that we need to kind of look out for. So again, I'm not noticing how this one is being pulled in and affected. But anyways, this is how you would add dust. So let's look at adding something that is a little different here. In this case, we want to do like water spots. We've actually got some brushes that can help us do that. So if we just pick this dots brush, I'm going to create another fill layer without using any smart materials or anything like that. And I'm just going to grab the paint bucket, create a fill layer, and here what you want to do is pick your color for the water spots. So if we want to make these something like this, start there. And then I want to add a mask that basically removes all of this so I can paint it back on in just little areas. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to add a black mask, which is going to get rid of that entire effect. And now all I have to do is paint on the mask by left clicking to have that selected. And anytime I paint on the mask, it will add that effect back in. So what we need to do is make sure that we have this this actual dots map here inside of our brush. And so what you can do is, again, you can drop it in the alpha right here with the alphas under this tab. So if you have something you want to use there, you can drop that in there. It has to match up with the kind of channel that you have. And so you have to make sure that that is the proper channel. If you're not seeing a diffuse channel, it's because we're trying to paint on the mask. And so you would have to actually go in and add a paint layer instead. And what you would want to do here is paint on the paint layer. And so let's see if we can get some of this to come back using one of our brushes. There we go. And so now we can grab our dots that we see here. That's going to automatically load in the alpha that's correct for this brush. You can scale this to the right size, and then you can sprinkle this back on just like that. Now, if it's too dark, brighten it up a little bit on the diffuse to where it's a little bit less noticeable there. You'll notice that it got rid of the paint layer, and that's because I selected the fill instead of the mask here. So make sure you're on the right selection. And now we can go back to the paint layer and add that on there. So one of the other things we may want to do is, again, lower the opacity so it's going on in really, really light increments. And then we can get in here and just kind of pick how we want to start painting. So if you're going to paint over here, once again, switch back to something like camera or tangent wrap, and then switch this back to objects. And then we can just go to town painting on this object. So your pen will also have priority in terms of how it is adding for your pen pressure. You can set that up over here. So this is set to no pressure on the size definition, but it is using pressure for the flow. So we can lower the pressure here a little bit. And now based on how hard I press, it will either add more dots or take away the amount of dots going down on the surface of this. So Lorian's saying, how about some cracks or chips in the china and dents in the silver? That's a good idea, says Misanthropy. So let us play with that a little bit as we get into some of this stuff. So what I want to do is I want to add a few more spots before we move along. So I'm going to turn the spacing up so they're getting a little further apart. And I'm going to zoom out so we can just really quickly brush some of this on. Now, again, it's really, really easy to go way too far with this. So you just want to make sure you get enough that it's going on correctly. Now, bear in mind, right now, the only thing that we are affecting is the mask that tells it how to go onto the material. So what we are not changing right now is any of these other attributes. So it's just going to paint this on using the diffuse color that we picked and any of these other settings that we play with. And what we haven't decided to change is all of these other attributes of the material, because you have to remember, if it's going to be something that's layering on top of the original material, it's going to lose some of its surface attributes. So if it's a really shiny plate like this, then you put water spots on top of it. Those water spots, because they're made out of a little bit of grime or dirt or whatever's in the water, it's going to lose the reflectivity. It's going to be a little less glossy, a little more rough. And so you're going to want to take this fill layer and you're going to want to lower the glossiness so that those water spots are more rough. And as we take this further and further down, you'll see this start to update a little bit. You'll also want to change the height or the normal information a little bit. So if we up this a little bit, you can see these water spots are starting to be raised off the surface of the plate. This is way too much. You're going to want to dial this down into something very, very shallow, because it's just a water spot, but it's just enough to give it a little bit of an edge so you can tell, and that's a 0.04. So that's not much, but as we rotate the light around, you'll notice that shadow rotates with it. And that's an important, very subtle aspect of what you need to do for these layers of dirt and grime, is adding that sort of thing in. Even this may need to come down a little more. Okay, so we've got a lot of small ones. Let's add a couple of bigger ones, and then let's move on to some of the chips and stuff in the glass for the ceramic here. So I'm gonna up the size quite a bit. And then I'm going to paint these on. Now, bear in mind too, you're not going to see most of this because it's going to be covered up by the cup that sits here. But I like to go ahead and texture things so that if I decide to move something around or cover something up, it's still going to be showing up. And so in this case, we're not ever really going to see the bottom part of this plate, but we might as well go ahead and paint some water spots on the surface of this, because who knows, you may want to use it for another project, and you don't want to spend a lot of time doing that if you don't need to, but enough to make it worth your while. So let's talk about how we might want to get in here and chip this up a little bit. So this starts with the base layer. So if I turn this off, you're going to see the default layer in Substance kind of shown through, and it's just this really basic diffuse color here. So it's a more gray than white. And what you want to do with the chip is you actually want to show the material underneath it. So in this case, what we're going to want to do is we're going to create another fill layer. Let's put this underneath the base here, and then we're going to add a mask to the base layer. Now in this case, I added a white mask, and that way it's going to keep the main layer until I paint the main layer away, okay? And then we want to start picking a brush that lets us chip up the sections of this for us. And so again, you want to be strategic about this. Where would it be chipped? Would it only be chipped on the rims of sort of the inside here? We've got a metallic rim on the edge, so there would be wear and stuff there, but it wouldn't be chipped because it's metallic. So I think we need to pick where we want to add a chip or a crack, and then kind of figure that out. So Lorian's saying a little puddle of cream, distracted archaeologist. Possibly. We need to add some water spots or some tea on the outside of this. For that, I'm going to actually do that in Blender because that's one of the things I wanted to show you guys. But let's quickly get in here, and I'm going to really fast go over how you would add in some of the cracks. So let's create a sort of darker color for this. So it's already dimmed a little bit, but I want to add in more of a sort of cream colored texture for the cracks. And if you want to, you can also kind of grunge it up a little bit more with a one of these procedural textures. So if you jump in here, if you go under the diffuse section, specular glossy, whichever of these has a color channel, you can actually go ahead and pick one of these procedural materials that has some noise and use that to help grunge up the inside of this. And so if we pick black and white spots and we were to put this on the height, you can see that it's going to really affect what that looks like. Now this is way too strong, obviously, and so you're going to want to bring this way down so that the inside is a lot less bumpy than that. But let's take a look at what we would do here. And so you can invert this, you can change the balance, the contrast there, and then you got your noise parameters. So roughness is something you'd want to bring down if that's too much. You can change the scale to be different there. Once again, bring that down, and you've got disorder. So one of the things we might do, let's bring this back down. You've got scale under the procedural texture, but you also have scale under the UV scale up here. So you can actually bring that further in. Now you're going to start noticing seams with some of these procedurals because of the way they're created. So I wouldn't go too high with that, but that is an option for one of the things that you can do to play with the size of your details here. And you can also play with adding in something like levels, which will let you affect the contrast here. So if we play with sort of the way this is looking, we can pick the affected channel here, pick the height channel, and then play with how this is being brought in here. And so if this is too much, we would just want to dial this in until we're getting something that's a little bit more effective here. So here we can bring the maximum height value down and then the minimum height value up to where it's a very subtle kind of effect. Obviously, if it's chipped, we don't want it to be really glossy like this. So for this layer, we just need to click this layer, go back up to the glossiness, and let's pull that down to where it's very, very sort of flat in nature. And remember, we're just talking about this sort of yellowish part over here because this surface on top is got a different material for this these decals and stuff. So I want it to seem almost like chalky in the way that it kind of comes across when you're rotating around. So I think that's pretty good. And obviously, if we have more time, we could spend adding some more textures and hand painting stuff in and all of that. But for now, let's turn back on our base layer. And on the white mask that we have here, all we need to do is kind of paint in and out where we want those chips to be. So let's go ahead and grab a brush, and might pick Cracks brush because I think that will be appropriate for this. And if we paint on with that, we need to be painting with the proper color here. So in this case, I think black on the white map is what we need. Make sure your opacity is set to the right all the way up to 100 if you want to see this. And then when you start painting this in, you should notice a difference. So what I'm going to do is brush this in a little bit and see if we can get this to start showing up. Okay. Let's play a little bit with why this is not working. All right, so I can see it there. So I'm wondering why we're not seeing it come through. Oh, there it is. Okay, so it's just not coming through enough for us to be able to really tell. Maybe the highlights from the environment were a little too strong. But here we can start really quickly brushing in some cracks, as you can see there. Now you have to remember that we're doing this on the base layer, and so the decals are above that, and you're not getting those going through to the other side. And so if we wanted to do it a different way to have it affect both, let's remove this mask from the base layer. And then for this section here, let's group all three of these into a new folder. And on this folder, we've got a separate mask that's already there for our plate. And so if we turn this off, we just have the raw material underneath. And now we can paint on this entire folder instead of those individual layers. And it will allow us to go ahead and dial this in here. Okay, so we're gonna add a mask, and now when we paint on it, you can see the cracks going all the way through to this bottom layer here. So again, if the opacity is too much, you can bring that down and have it affect it differently there. I would start off pretty subtle. You might even stretch out the spacing a little bit so that it's not so strong. But if you really want to quickly add in some basic aging, this would be a good way to do it on porcelain. You'll notice that a lot of the porcelain that cracks sometimes have a bluish tint to it. So if you want to add that in, all you got to do is go to the diffuse color and again, just change this over to something that's got more of that undertone that's a little bit more bluish. You'll see this a lot on antique sort of stuff there. So one of the things you'll want to do as well is make sure that you kind of drop the intensity for that so that it is not going to seem unnatural and glow around the outside edges, but that's a good way to do that. So yeah, that's how you do that. Is there anything else we wanted to do? Let's add some actual chips that are a little different from the cracks. So I'm gonna add, grab a different brush here, go back to this map, and just pick our crystal brush. We'll lower the size here in the viewport. And then let's paint in some of this. Now, in this case, I'm probably not going to want to go bluish with this for this type of thing because it's not going to give us the original sort of intent. But here we can, on the fly, kind of dial in, what we want this to look like. And it needs to kind of be the right intensity for the diffuse color, or it's going to kind of give away, the way this effect is working. So make sure you got that going on. Also remember that this layer is going to be lower in heights than the rest of this because we're digging into the material. And so for the heights, you're going to want to pull this down for this layer. And that goes back to the levels. So the levels are actually going to need to go negative in this direction, and the height is going to start basically like at 0, and then you're going to go down with the cracks. So it cuts into that material, which hopefully is obvious there. I'm not sure if it is, but so yeah, that's what you would need to do for that. If it's not really working enough to differentiate itself in the way that it's standing out from the rest of the plate, then what I would do is go ahead and reset the height on the other materials. So in this case, we could go into this layer here, and remember we're in a folder. So for the base, we would want to pull the height up a little bit. And so that way, now all the cracks are showing that they're cutting into the material here. Now again, you're going to want to start off very subtle, 0.04 for that. The decals even need to have a little bit of height on top of that. And so once again, we'll go a little higher, maybe a 0.06 or 0.07 for the painted on details. And then the highest details would be for the water spots. So we'll select this layer and then make sure you go back in here. And once you're on the right setting, you should be able to dial this into, let's say 0.1 for the water spots. And so now you've got separate layers stacked on top of each other of height information, and that's all going to be exported kind of automatically. So we got other ideas. We got grains of sugar we can add. That's a very good idea. All of that I'm going to do in Blender because it would be a little easier and faster to just do it there. So let's go ahead and talk about how I export this back out of Substance into Blender. And I'll, obviously later go back and do some more painting and do some more details. But right now, I want to get into a little bit more stuff tonight before we have to wrap up the stream. So one of the things I want to fix before I do this is I don't like how bumpy this got. So let's go back into this histogram over here, this levels, and let's change how this is kind of working. So I'm going to right click and turn all the rest of this stuff off. I'm just going to look at this bottom layer so I can tell what this texture is doing. Okay. Okay. Yeah, it's a little bit more like what I wanted. And I want it to be even more subtle than that. So I'll pull that up a little bit, pull this down even a little bit more. There we go. Okay, so now that shouldn't be coming through quite as harsh on the rest of the plate. And let's again talk about how we can export. So make sure you're saving often so that if it crashes, because it can happen, you don't lose everything. But let's talk about how I get these back out of Substance. Now, typically what you would want to do if you're using a PBR workflow is you would want to let Substance give you PBR materials to put back into the Cycles principled BSDF. And you would do that by going to File, Export Textures, and then you're going to want to pick the folder that it's being exported to, and then make sure you're using the correct export settings from here. And so for the project that you create, it will typically give you whatever you need to be using. But if it was a spec gloss workflow, you would pick that. Metallic rough, you would pick this, and it would automatically give you for each of your texture sets all of the image maps that you need to load back into Blender for this. Now, in our case, because we have sort of, made an impression and we have, some people that know about Blender in the community, we actually have our own maps that we can use that are exported. And so now if you look under Blender, you can see that for basic Blender work, you've got all of the original things that you would need for the PBR shaders. So if you're going to be using the principled workflow in Blender, all you have to do is select the Blender output here instead of the regular PBR exports, and it will give you pretty much every possible map that you would need to export. Now in our case, I'm not going to be exporting the silver because we didn't actually do anything to the silver in terms of texturing. So I'm going to work on that later. So I'm turning this off, and then I'm going to make sure I have my China texture turned on, and it's going to give me a height map and all of my other maps in one folder, and I can pick my final export size. So in this case, maybe I want to do like a 2K for the saucer because that's the original. And make sure you have the right folder selected. So those are all going to go there. Then under the config, what I've actually been doing is picking the document channels to export instead of the Blender channels. So what you can do if you want to be using something that's a non-PBR workflow is it will actually just give you what you have in your texture sets. So if I hit cancel and I go over to this, these are your document channels. And so you've got already diffuse, specular, glossy, height, normal, all that stuff. And if you don't specifically adhere to the PBR workflow, you don't always need all the PBR maps. And so if you add or remove all this stuff as needed, you can export this sort of stuff. Obviously, any of the maps that you brought in, you can export those as well. But in my case, I'm going to go to export textures, use my document channels, and let's see what we get here. Excuse me. Okay, so it's going to save all those on disk. It's going to tell me I have some warnings, and usually this has to do with the fact that you don't have all of the channels that it's trying to export in your texture sets. So you can ignore that if it's not super necessary for your project. And now we can see all of these exported back out over here. And so it's already giving me a diffuse. It does all of the padding for me, so I don't have to worry about not having enough information into these areas that don't have UVs. So it will expand that automatically, and it's just great. So let's look at the cycles material, and I'll show you kind of what I've got going on here. So let's jump back into our scene over here. Open back up my scene 12. First, I'll talk about the setup for the plate, the saucer, and then I'll talk about how to reload those textures as you go. And so it's actually a really quick workflow once you've got it down. So for my base material, basically I just have a diffuse with a pretty high rough value. And then I added in some subsurface scattering so that the China would have a little bit of an interior light bouncing around on the inside, because anything with ceramic or anything like that has a little bit of a subsurface glow to it. And that gives the sense of a little bit of a translucent material that we have in cycles. And so all I did was I pulled in my substance export for the diffuse map here. That goes straight into the color channel. And then I added these two together because I'm using a subsurface scattering. And again, that's just adding a little bit of glow, maybe not even necessary for your scene, but for me, I wanted to add it for this. And then I moved into the second layer of the material, which would be the decals painted on top. So you gotta remember, this is gonna be hand painted, probably if it's fine china. So they're gonna paint this on with a special material, special substance that's gonna be glazed into the actual final version of the plates. And so this is a mask that I created, and I have a special technique that I use to make this, which I'll show you. So let me split this so you can actually see what this looks like in the UV editor. And this is the mask. And all this is a black and white mask telling Blender where the painted on details are for the plate. So anything that's black is not going to be affected. Anything that's white is going to have what I choose to be the sort of paint material. And I did this because, again, we're not using our PBR specific workflow, and I wanted to define how the paint would look in my own setup. And so I've got two sections for the paint itself. One is a diffuse section, one is a glossy. These are being mixed with a custom factor for giving it a little bit of shine, but it's also a little bit of diffuse. Both of these are being driven by the original diffuse map, which if I show you what this looks like, we can go to the China diffuse map that you can see here. So the original China diffuse map is actually exported without any of the decals painted onto it. And that way I can, again, separate the process so that the decals go on custom in Blender. And so I just wanted to get this surface by itself created. And so let's look at this map. This one's actually what it looks like now. So we've got kind of the idea of that. And so what I needed to do was I needed to find a way to separate these processes, because if you export straight out of Substance, it's just going to give you everything in one diffuse map. So you're going to have all of your grunge, all of your dirt, and all that stuff in one flattened image, and I didn't want that. And so all you really have to do is kind of turn things on and off. So back in Substance, when we export, I would basically have one folder that has my water spots, decals, all of that stuff separate. And I would just turn stuff on and off. So I would take off the water spots and the decals to where we just have the base here. And in my case, if I was gonna go ahead and add in this where, I might even do a totally separate map that just has the where by itself. And then I would layer that all back inside of Blender. So it really just depends on what you wanna do. But in my case, I'll probably just go ahead and separate the base and the damage all in one layer for the cracks. That's fine. And so if you want to, you can go ahead and then export the diffuse here. And so again, all the same settings pretty much as before. Hit export. And now you're going to see that that only gives us the original maps with the damage included, no decals or anything like that. In Photoshop, what I had to do was create a separate image map for the decals. And so there's a really easy thing to do in Substance. You just click this Photoshop icon in this toolbar, and you can pick exactly what to bring over by your materials. So you can just check stuff on and off. In my case, I just checked off everything except for one of these channels because it's still going to give you all of these layers. And so then I hit OK. That's going to open Photoshop and bring in all the layers from Substance. And so now I've still got all of these kind of separated. And so now what I can do is I can say, all right, well, let's turn off everything except for the decals. And I'm going to pull the decals up to the top layer. So this is by itself. And now what I want to do is let's add in a white fill layer. And I'm going to use a clipping mask to drop in the white fill on top of all of our details for the decals. And then under that, I want it to just be black. So let's create a new layer below that and fill it with black. And so what I can do now is merge all of that down into one layer, and I save this as a PNG in that same folder right here, okay? And so you don't have to save this. If you do save it and you go back to Substance, it'll keep your settings on these layers, but I'm going to just exit without saving, which won't affect anything in Substance, but I got what I needed. So now when we go back into Blender and we load this decals mask, you can see that we've got that in place. So everything that's white is going to use the second input, which in our case is going to be the glossy mixed with the diffuse for the paint. Anything that's coming in the left channel uses the black areas, which is again our original base material, which is going to be our ceramic with the damage on it. And then we can start talking about how to layer on top of that. So we've got our base material, we've got the painted details on top, and then we need to start adding in the final shiny part. And so for this, it's pretty simple. Again, I pulled in a mix shader with 2 levels of glossy. For this, they're different types of roughness. So apart from the regular diffuse map that we got from Substance, we also have a, let me get to the right folder here. We also have a glossy map. So if we look at the glossiness, you can see that all the areas that have cracks or rough wear, things like that, are going to be darker, which tells Blender that these are a little bit more rough. And so you can think of these like numerical values. Anything that's closer to white is going to be a 1.0. Anything that's closer to black is going to be a 0. And so instead of typing in a roughness value, like we would here, if we feed an image map into this, it gives you various levels of roughness depending on where it is on the object. And it uses the UV map to drive how it applies that to your 3D object. And so by, again, using Substance's advantage of painting this all in there for us, we don't have to manually kind of do that ourselves. We can basically just use all of that image map to do that as we pull this in. And then once we import this into Blender, I'll pull this in as an image file, and I use this in multiple places. You can see every single area is basically getting this roughness pulled into the glossy and the diffuse values right here. And then once we get this into this area, I'm using the Fresnel effect to add in a little bit of glossy effect on the surface, which is giving us that really reflective, shiny, mirror-like finish. And then I've got a separate thing down here for the bump, which is just giving us a tiny little bit of surface variation so that it doesn't come off like a mirror-like finish. So I know that it was like a really quick run through of how this works, but that's how I kind of think about layering my materials up. As I start here on the left and I kind of work sideways, adding one section after another of various details. And so that's kind of how we would need to do it. Now we need to think about this a little bit in terms of how we would add this layering at this point, because we've gone through and added more details. And so we're going to need to start with a clean version of the plate, which is basically going to be this thing that we imported right here. We want to see how that looks. We can jump out of full screen mode. I'm going to solo the plate. So we're just going to look at textured view. And then we're going to switch to texture. So this is going to show us whatever we have selected in our node editor for the current image. So if we switch to the glossy node down here, you can see that this is the glossy map applied with the UVs. And this is the diffuse map. So you can notice that we successfully exported without all the decals and stuff like that. We shouldn't have the water spots or anything like that on there. And now if we click this, you can see the decals mask. So that's how that's applied. And as we get further and further into this, you can test any of your image maps just by selecting those. And so what we would have to do now is if we changed anything for the decals mask, we would obviously want to re-export that from Photoshop, like I just mentioned. In this case, we haven't, so we don't actually have to change or update that. This will automatically be exported and updated the same as our diffuse map was, so that's fine. So the only thing we really have to think about exporting additionally at this point is the water spots. So let's turn off everything here just so we can mentally get a check of what we need to talk about exporting. So in this case, yeah, we just need the water spots layer. So let's go back into Photoshop, and I'm just going to grab another black and white image for those water spots. So again, in this case, we just need to drag this to the top. Let's turn everything else off. Everything, I'm going to apply the mask. Everything above is going to get a white fill. We're going to use Alt and left click to create a clipping mask. Everything below is going to get a black fill there. And you can see those showing up now. So now let's merge all of these, save this as a water spots mask. And so we'll start here. Rename this. And let's look at how to apply this in Blender. Okay, so we're actually going to have a fourth layer now. And this is going to go on top of the surface glaze because remember, the water, if it's been through a dishwasher or something like that, is going to be added after the fact. So this is actually something like dust or something on top of the material. So let's go ahead and pull in a new image texture. We're going to select this from our folder under Textures, Saucer. And then we want to look for water spots, pull this in. And I'm going to build this sort of outside the rest of our texture at first so we can kind of get a good feel for how this looks. So now we can see this showing up in our 3D viewport. And what we need to do is think about how to create a layer material that is going to show this correctly. So we already know we're going to have some sort of transparency that's going to put this on top of the rest of our shader network over here. So let's go ahead and add in a shader, transparent shader. To mix this in with whatever we do for our water spots, we're going to need a mix shader. And so the transparent shader is going to go on the top. Whatever we do here, let's just say it's a diffuse, is going to go in the bottom. And here we would actually pick the color that we want to use for our water spots. And so we just kind of approximated back in Substance, but now we can actually dial in either with an image map or we just pick a color here of what kind of spots we want. we can dial that in. And I'm going to save again because this was feeling a little buggy a second ago. Okay, so let's plug our color into the factor here, and that will drive anything that's white will be a water spot, which is this. Anything that's black will be transparent, which is this. And now this is going to plug into our final material output. And this mix shader is going to plug into the other socket. And so what we need to do is take all of this, because it's one section, which is the water spots. We need another mix shader. And in this section, we're going to have the water spots be placed on top. We're going to use the alpha into the factor, and then we're going to pull the water spots here. So this is actually what we're going to pull into the final output. So let's take a look at what we have now. Jump out of this mode here. I'm going to reposition my camera. Let's grab our camera and pull this out a little bit. And let's do a quick render and see if we got what we need. Solarian is saying water spots should be more amoeba shaped. And maybe they should. Okay, so I'm getting a little bit of a weird read on some of this, so I'm going to rotate around so I can make sure that I'm not just getting a weird glare from the angle that I was at. Let's preview from this direction. Okay, yeah, so we're getting some sort of weird effect because of the setup that we've changed. So let's kind of troubleshoot and see what might have happened to our setting over here. Okay, so just 101, the first thing I do is I take everything after I know what worked, and then I break that apart from there. So we know based on this texture that this should be working. So if we preview what this looks like in the render, we should see our black and white mask coming through right here for the water spots. So we got that working. What we also know is that if we want to have the water spots by themselves, they can't just be 100% diffuse because they also need to be a little bit transparent. And so what we need to do instead of mix here is we actually need to define how much the water spots are normally transparent. So in this case, let's say that we pull the mix shader up to about, so if it's closer to the left side, it's going to be using more of the transparency instead of the diffuse. So if we were to preview what this looks like now, you should see more of a transparent, sort of clear glaze on this. And we want to dial that in to where it's working kind of well. So here it's actually showing the entire plate is transparent, which is kind of funny. But in our case, let's dial that back a little bit more so we got some more opaqueness happening, because this is water, but it's dirty water. Okay, so we still should kind of be able to see through this, but it kind of looks like dirty water to me. If we really want to get technical, we might even use a glass shader because it is water, but it's dried water. So I think diffuse is more appropriate in this particular case. But this whole section right here of 3 nodes is our water spots sort of separated out by itself. This is the map we're using to drive where they go on the plate. And so now that we have that, we take our main shader, pull that into our mix. We take our color input here and make sure that we have that driving into the factor of the mix shader. Anything that's white is going to use the second material. Anything that's black is going to use the original material. So now we should have what we need if we plug this into our material output. So let's test this. Okay, still getting something that is not working correctly. Okay, so it looks like the original issue isn't from the water spots, it's further back than that. So we need to actually go back a little further and test what might have happened here for our materials. So again, start at the furthest over side and then troubleshoot going to the right. So if we start here, let's just say we're gonna look at our base material. We plug this in using the node wrangler for our China. And this one's also the same material. So by comparing these two, we can kind of see what they should look like. And I don't think this is broken at this point. So it looks like we're good here. So let's move further down the line. And we know based on this that we should have the decals painted on top, and it should look correct from this point of view. So let's plug this in and see what that's looking like. Okay, so already we know there's a problem. Our decals are not coming in fully opaque. They are kind of transparent. So let's check and see where we're going wrong here. Let's turn this off. Let's go back to our decals mask and switch into texture view. Okay, so it looks like our decals mask is correct, which means, again, that we need to figure out where we're going wrong. So I'm gonna pull in the diffuse here so we can check that. Let's go back into render view. So the diffuse is working correctly there. We go down here. And the diffuse is, again, it's pulling from the same place, which is working correctly there. So the biggest problem we have at this point is that we have the color input coming from the diffuse section, which we changed. We actually had the color coming from the diffuse because it had the decals painted into it, and I forgot about that. And so what we actually need to do is go back into Substance and pull the decals with the damage into one continuous map. So let's go ahead and export this. And that's just one of those things that I hadn't thought about. And so it's kind of why we're testing it. So once you've exported again and you've done that, all you need to do is grab your texture that you just exported and hit Alt-R, and that will reload the image back into Substance for you. So let's jump into the saucer section, make sure we got the right thing here. So that looks correct, except for the base is not turned on. So we need to turn those on and then re-export. Okay, so now we should be good. So now we reload our image, and there we go. Got everything inside, and now we should notice if we go all the way back, hopefully this is all working correctly again. But that's a perfect example of something that you deal with all the time, and you just have to kind of step through your node setup and figure out what went wrong and where. So you may or may not be able to see the water spots because of the render having to clean up, but they are there at this point. Okay, so we had talked about some other things we might want to do. We don't have a lot of time, but let's talk quickly about how I would go about adding in some of those other details. So in 3D view, we have some things already here that we can use to our advantage. So you talked about adding like sugar granules on the top of the plate. We already actually have a lot of objects here that have these connected. So if we select one of these, we can duplicate it. And this is another example of where a particle system would work better if you were going to do tons of them. But since I'm just going to want to create a few of these, I'm going to pull a sugar granule off of the sugar cubes. And then I'm just going to drop this onto the surface of our plate here. So once I've got one in place, I can jump into edit mode, grab this object here, and then I can play with placing these using facial snapping on the rest of our objects here. So these are going to be super tiny. I may or may not bevel these. They're so small, you'd have to really blow this up to tell that it was just a basic triangular shape. But let's go ahead and play with possibly beveling these. And again, you're going to want to kind of rotate these so that they're in a more random configuration than this. So, you know, I'd work on this a little bit more later. This is not an example of where particles will probably help you, because you're going to have the same problem doing a random sort of setup like this. But let us play. Okay, so let's say that's enough. Let's bevel these tiny bit. And that should be enough. And then for droplets, basically what I would do is what we did before with the bubbles on the inside, but these are going to be more flattened. So if we create a mesh, we can create like an icosphere, place it somewhere over here. And in this case, let's go ahead and get rid of some of this sphere so that it's more flat. I'm going to use proportional edit for this so we can squash this up a little bit. And all I'm doing here is selecting a vertex or a few in this case, and I'm squashing this by scaling on the z-axis down. And with proportional edit, you can actually make like a sort of a flat bottom by doing this, which is kind of a handy little method there. So what we would want to do now is we would want to assign the T material to this object. So it's got the same basic shading setup. Let's shrink this way down. We can apply the scale. And then let's pull this down so that it's sitting on the surface of our object here. So in this case, if we grab both of these objects and solo them, we can just work on them separately. So I'm going to pull, again with proportional edit, I'm going to kind of shape this into place. So using a mixture of wireframe and solid shading, let's kind of position the bottom of this. And what you're kind of going to want to do here is get this to sit flat. So you can do this manually. We talked a little bit about methods for this in the other live stream when we were doing the sculpting on the pipe. But this is a good example of something where you want it to sit flat on a surface, and you don't want to have to sit here and manually tweak this a lot. And so what you can do is if you, let's say we unsolo this, so we're back to just the T droplet here. Everything that's on the bottom, I want to be in its own vertex group. So let's go to the object or data tabs over here. I'm going to add another vertex group, and then I'm going to select all of the vertices that are going to be kind of flattened here. I want to deselect any of the ones that are going to need to kind of stay on the outside edges, so they're not part of the bottom of this. But I think this is probably a good representation of the flat side of this object. And we're going to add this to this vertex group. I want to invert this selection and remove everything. And so if we test this for our vertex groups, everything that is assigned, if we hit select, will show up. And that's how we know what is in the vertex group. You can also jump into the weight paint mode, and it'll show you everything in red that is assigned to the group. Everything in blue is not assigned to the group. And we can use this to help drive how this is flattened on the bottom. And so if we take a look in our modifier stack over here, let's add a modifier, and we're going to do a shrink wrap modifier. We're going to target the saucer here. We're only going to use the vertex group that we just created, which means that if we switch into wireframe view, it's going to flatten the bottom of the tea droplet perfectly. We're going to want to click keep this above the surface so that it is not going to go through the mesh. We've got a couple of little points here that are kind of poking through the bottom already. So we're going to pull those up a little bit. So that's not happening. But for the most part, especially if you add in a layer of subdivision above the shrink wrap, it's really going to work well here for this. And the more subdivisions you have, the easier it is for it to wrap this to the bottom of the mesh. So turn that up a little bit more, and now you can see we have a really flat bottom there. So I'm not going to keep that turned up in the viewport, but I will keep that turned up for the render. So let's jump back into our original render camera up here. Let's zoom in on this area and let's take a look at this. So I'm not sure if we'll notice the sugar granules. They're very, very tiny. So we may have to scatter quite a few more of these so they show up. But we should notice the tea droplets. So before I close out the stream, I'm going to do a render of this so you guys can see what this would look like sort of in a final preview. I'll turn this up full size so we can see what this would look like. And I'm even going to blow this up because I think it needs to be a little bigger than this. So Lauren is asking, when I say particles, am I talking about another program? No, actually, I'm talking about Blender. We haven't talked about it in the streams yet, but Blender has its own particle system, which is what I used to create the sugar cubes with all of the little particles on the outside. So I didn't have to model every single one of those objects. I actually just created one and then was able to duplicate that around the scene and use that. So hopefully this doesn't crash. Tried to cancel the render and it's freaking out a little bit on me. But hope you guys enjoyed tonight. I wanted to kind of walk you through what I've been working on this weekend. And before I go, I was hoping to give you guys a render, but I'm not sure if it's gonna let me. So I'm gonna give it 1 second to kind of adjust itself and unfreeze there. Before I go, kind of show you some of the other stuff I worked on this weekend. There we go, now it's fine. So let's make this a 200% render. Start that render. And heck, why not? Let's make it a 500% render. Make it big enough so you guys can see it. While that's rendering, I'm going to show you guys what I worked on. So I did a little doily, which I was actually not planning on doing because it ended up being a lot of work. I think I did this yesterday. But I created this pattern in Illustrator and then basically pasted this into Photoshop, like you can see here. And once I pulled that in, I was able to go on top of this and create a layer that was just kind of dirty and grimy. And so if we just unclipping mask this, you can kind of see what I did. I discolored a lot of it, and then I painted with a textured brush some of this lacy pattern that you see on top of it. And by keeping it semi-transparent, I was able to make that look kind of correct. And then after that, in Photoshop, you can actually generate a normal map from a texture. And so once I had a black and white texture that I was able to generate here, I was able to go to filter for this layer. And then I went to 3D, and I actually am gonna have to make sure I have the right thing selected. And let's duplicate this and I'll show you how I did it. So grab all of these, duplicate and merge, turn this off. I create another layer, and it's exactly the same process as we were talking about tonight for substance, and made a white and black. and then was able to merge this all down into one flattened image. And then I can go to 3D or filter 3D and then generate a normal map. And that will let me create a normal map from this one layer that has the same sort of bump information that you would find if you were going to Blender. So this is the effect that I got. I blurred it a little bit so that it wasn't so extreme, but that allowed me to get this little doily effect underneath the plate. And so let's see where this went. Here it is, way down here. Okay, so yeah, you can see that's how you would add a little tea droplet effect there. The sugar granules are somewhere in here. I can't really see them because they're really, really reflective. So I would have to play a little bit with getting those to show up, but this is basically how you would add it. So this is a really high res image and you can see the textures are starting to fall apart on some of the painting. But anyways, this is kind of how you would do that. So the pattern was something that I looked up on the internet and kind of used for reference. But if I pull this open in Illustrator, I can kind of show you what I did. And then I gotta go, but it's it took a while. It took kind of all day. But these are all separate groupings and things like that. And I started off with really basic, circles, and then duplicated those around in a circle and created more and more patterns. And then eventually got to a point where I was grouping larger patterns into bigger segments and was able to just, again, duplicate this around 8 or so times using specific, degrees around the circle. And I just kind of built that out and stuff like that. Now it's not perfect around the edges, so I had to go back in and kind of fill in those details. So this is more the final version with it all collapsed and combined. But this is what I use to pull into Photoshop. And as you zoom in real close, you can see it's nothing but just curves and stuff. And I have little boxes that are dashed lines for the stitches and stuff like that. And so a good example of, when you zoom in and you look at something really close up, it's not complicated. It's just basic shapes. But this was enough to give the render engine the information that it needed to create that stitching. And the rest of it's just proper materials to make it look like fabric. So I used a basic diffuse material. It's not super complicated. So if we look at the material itself, I can jump down here and you can see the actual doily is just it's a flat plane with some subdivision on it. So if you actually solo this, it's really nothing complicated at all. It's just one subdivided plane that has a couple of divisions there. But the impressive part, again, comes in the amount of time that you put into the material. So if you go into textured view, you can see that I UV unwrapped it, which was really easy. And at this point, jump into the doily material. And so I pulled in the bump map that I made in Photoshop, made sure that I put that into all of the shaders here. You can see that I use a really basic diffuse and glossy with a Fresnel effect to blend that. And then I just added transparency using the black and white mask that we created right here. So the alpha is what's driving the black and white transparency so that you can see through the object. It won't show up here because of Blender's texturing limitations in the way that it shows in the viewport. But you can see kind of what that looks like. This is the normal map over here. So that's showing up there. And then by the time you get to the end over here, if we add a basic lamp, let's add a point light or something. We select this area of the screen so it renders. You can see how it works, and it's pretty simple. It's basically just a flat plane with transparency, and by using that Fresnel effect on the shader and using the discoloration from the Photoshop texture, we're able to dial in how this looks, and you can zoom in pretty far without it getting to where it loses its realism. Now, depth-wise, it's really there's no depth. It's all faked with the way that the textures are working. But since we're only viewing this from an upward angle, we're never flat on the surface of the table. This is really all I needed to make this work. And it casts shadows. It does everything you would normally expect from a shader like this. So yeah, ended up working out pretty well. A little intimidating to work on when you're thinking about the complexity of the pattern, but all of the work was really done in generating the texture in Illustrator. Getting it into Blender was the easy part. So I hope you guys enjoyed tonight's. If you're new to this live stream, please subscribe to the channel and like the video that you watched tonight. If you haven't familiarized yourself with any of my stuff before, I am a Blender Foundation certified trainer. So if you go to theorangeguild.com, you can see my training site for Blender. And then if you go in here, you can see all my courses. So this is a little bit about me. If you click here, you can learn more about becoming a guild member. It's really, really affordable. It's only $9 a month, $99 a year to access all of my courses, all the current ones and the new ones coming out. You get those automatically included in the membership, or you can still purchase those individually. If you go to the training section, I'm logged in right now, so you're not going to see pricing on any of this stuff, but you have access to all of the courses that I currently have available for Blender. As I mentioned earlier in the stream, I have tons more on the way that I'm planning and trying to get together. But these are the courses that I currently have. And I just updated the live stream Hangouts yesterday. So now if you go into the live stream Hangouts and you enroll in this training, you can jump into here, continue to the course, and you've got every single live stream I've done so far, over 40 hours on the guild. And there's a special bonus live stream that I did just for guild members that is right here. That is all about how I painted the map texture that you saw tonight under the fossil in Photoshop and Illustrator. So if you're more interested in learning how I did more complex stuff with that sort of texture, check that out. It's 5 hours. I did that one day on Saturday. So you can jump in there and see that. But anyways, thank you guys so much for watching tonight. I can't wait to bring you some more stuff. I'm going to be coming live again tomorrow at 7 p.m. and Friday. So not sure exactly what we're going to talk about yet, but I'm open to ideas. So if you guys would like to leave me a comment in the comments section, always would love to talk to you guys and hear what you have to say about the streams, about the channel, or about Blender. In the meantime, hope you guys have a wonderful evening, and I will see you guys tomorrow night.